And fast forward to the meeting, we have, four of the most senior creatives in the company, and Jay, me, and the creatives are waxing poetic about the brand and how like this can be transformative or inspirational, and they're talking super high level. And my job in that meeting was to rope them back down to earth and say, hey, 2 months, I need to get started on this today, and I need to know what it looks like and what it does.
Hey everybody, welcome to our webinar, Finding the Implicit Design. This is the third webinar in our series of Essentials of Product Innovation. And we are excited to just talk through this topic with you today, and I'm joined by two fantastic colleagues. So just to give you a sense of who we are and who's in the room. So my name is Ben Johnson. I am the head of our mobile and emerging tech group. And with me, I'll just start with Jay, who's to my right.
Hey, I'm Jay Clark. I'm a lead iOS engineer here at Rightpoint. I've made about 10 apps in my tenure here, and about half of them I've made with my good friend Dave, to my right.
Hi, I'm Dave. I'm a creative director here, and I've been with Rightpoint or earlier versions for about 10 years. And I have absolutely no idea how many projects I have worked
on. So we've all worked on a lot of projects, and I think part of today is sharing that information with our listeners. So just to kind of get us started, Dave, why are we here?
We're here because design doesn't function well on an island or any other kind of cabinetry. So I just wanted to share, sort of what a good design might look like, right? It's a corner, it's a little tricky, but you kind of think it's going to work. And then, of course, when you build it, you find that it doesn't work. And then I think that I offer this example mostly because, something can look perfectly fine on paper, right? But until you have the input from development and maybe do some user testing, you don't really know whether it's going to succeed or fail. And in this case, on the right, it was a design failure. It was also a development failure because somebody knew those drawers were going to do that when they put the handles on.
This never happens in software.
This never happens in software. So the important thing is that design is always better if it's vetted by development.
Absolutely. So I think that's a great theme. And so just to talk a little bit more about this talk and where we were kind of thinking about it and what we're going to share today, I just want Jay to give us a little bit of lay of land.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to talk about our original title for this talk, which discussed the tension between design and development. And in addition to this title being like a little long and clunky, we ended up shying away from it just because we were afraid of that word tension. And we kind of thought that it would conjure up an image like this, which is design and development fighting each other, pulling the product in opposite directions, and ultimately moving nowhere. When in reality, the tension that we want to be talking about and discussing looks more akin to a hammock, where the tension is required for the product to exist, right? There are these two pillars that are supporting the product and pulling it in opposite directions, but ultimately lifting the product up.
Really elevating the quality of the product.
Right.
Yeah, and literally in the earth.
So it's great. You guys are on an island, singing Kumbaya and having margaritas as a part of our projects. But let's talk about what other groups are sort of involved, and is it just design development? Like, how do you guys think through this natural tension?
Yeah, and in reality, products are the result of a bunch of different tensions. So development, design, and product. And all three of these sources of constraints and tensions are shaping the product and what it's going to ultimately end up being. And product here, the way we're using this word product, it represents, so development, doing the implementation, design, what it looks like. Product is kind of the higher level, managing the what features we want to do in what order, what's the best answer for the user.
So maybe more like the business mindset, user, product mindset, like sort of encapsulating requirements. That's
Right,
sort of the
and-
role that we're talking
Yeah,
about.
and keeping the team moving, keeping
Yeah.
the greatest amount of contribution coming from every single member of the team.
Got it.
And I think as my career progresses here and at Rightpoint, the more that I'm building towards these other pillars and the more well-rounded of a developer I end up being. So I kind of consider myself half a designer and half of a product owner at this point.
And I, I have Xcode on my machine. I'm a designer, but I have Xcode on my machine. I test things for myself on my screen, or on my own computer. I have Android Studio, available to me to test things that I understand. I'm not saying that I can do all of those things, but I feel like I owe it to the product to be able to do that kind of work, just to validate my own work. And I think there is a danger for designers who kind of work exclusively in Sketch, that they're not really designing experiences, they're just designing screens.
And I think that's probably a theme that folks on the webinar will hear a lot, that there's this collaboration between these two disciplines is really healthy. It doesn't have to be bad tension, it can really be good tension. So let's talk maybe a little bit about sort of why the tension exists. Like what's inherently, at the end of the day, you're two colleagues. Yes, you're different disciplines, but like why is there tension between these two groups? I'm sure our listeners have felt this, but I just want you guys to talk through why you think it manifests.
Well, as a great man once said, designers are from Mars and developers are from Venus. And maybe there'll be a future talk on that. But I think we do definitely approach the same problem or the same opportunity in different ways.
Yeah, so I feel like developers tend to approach problems in more absolute terms, lower level implementation. They want to know, exactly how many points away from the bottom this button is, or exactly how a motor is going to work, or exactly how we're going to make the product do the thing it's supposed to do.
Right, and if you're, to extend the car analogy, I'm thinking more about like how easy is it to get into the driver's side of the car, and that's maybe the 80% case. It's just like getting to, the sitting down in front of the steering wheel, and then maybe, after I'm reminded of some edge cases that I have to think about how comfortable is the person in the middle seat in the back row,
So I think, it's a funny illustration that I know you did, Dave, but I think a lot of people probably feel like this, especially if you've designed your organization in such a way that design really is, on an island somewhere else or on another planet, that there really is quite a gap between the two. But as you guys sort of talk through it, I kind of want to maybe laser in Jay just on the development piece of this and just talk through how engineers sort of approach these problems. How do they view designers? How do they think that designers...
Yeah, so as for a developer, this is more or less my best guess of how Dave's brain works. So there's this, and I made this slide.
Yeah, I was just going to say, that looks like a developer slide.
So there's some black box, right? This represents Dave's thought process, and he looks at something, a piece of art or a screen or a user interaction, and his juju acts on it, and he gets this feeling of if it works or if it doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, he tweaks something, and he does that and repeats, and then finally it works and it gets delivered to me. And the implicit design, what we're kind of trying to talk about today, is there's this gap, between how Dave thinks about problems, which is more high level. He tends to talk about things like user journeys and mood and feel, and I tend to think more at an implementation level, which is, how is this screen going to look on an iPad or on a small iPhone? What are the margins? What's the alignment? What are the constraints? And so the implicit design is more or less the hidden rules that translate Dave's high-level ideas into the low-level answers for how to render and reconcile your vision for the product.
And I think, for me, the implicit design kind of coming in is something that the product is, I'm going to use like a designer language, right, is speaking to me, right? Is there something about this? I'm trying to figure out what's unique about this product, what's going to differentiate it, and what experience we can create that is unique to this product that's going to differentiate
So
it.
give me an example. Like what's a good, Like, is it the animations? Is it the
well, if it calls for
visuals?
that, right? So
Yeah.
it's what's the personality of
Yeah.
this app? What's the what kind of language do they use when they're talking about what the experience is going to be?
Yeah.
If it's light or if it's fun or for it's for some kind of entertainment property, then I think yes, animation, right? We use animation though for medical stuff as well, because animation can really isolate. What you need to do, say, to onboard someone to use a medical device.
Yeah.
And so animation can be delightful, but it also can be super instructive because it clears out, or can clear out, all of the extra stuff that might be present in a video that you don't want people distracted by. You can really isolate what you want people to learn. So that's just one specific example, but
Sure.
but you're always looking for the unique characteristic about the product that you can help convey and differentiate it in the marketplace.
And so I guess the hypothesis is how do we get to those sort of, we're in these two different worlds, and how do we get to the middle?
Yeah. Right, and I just recommend like having a lot of touch points between design and development.
Yeah, so let's maybe talk through that, because I especially for this talk, I want people to come away with some ways in which that you or our listeners can take advantage of this with their teams, with their process, their methodologies. What can they do to sort of force this healthy tension? So yeah, let's talk through just sort of and this is a little bit of a software life cycle simplified. There's some terms that I think probably reflect how we think about the world, but you can think about this in the way that it works at your organization. So maybe start with kickoff. Obviously, every project has some sort of start. What do you guys find valuable in those kickoffs that brings you closer to that implicit design?
Well, in our kickoffs, I think it's crucial that we have development in the room. It's not just the creatives thinking of, or what we call creatives, because developers are creative too.
Yeah.
But it's having everybody in the room who's going to make a contribution to what the thing is and how we're going to get there, and knowing what the pitfalls might be. So really, but the biggest thing is getting everybody bought in a direction that we're all going to row, and surfacing all the ideas that everybody has so that they feel heard. And most of the time we come out with great development ideas and great design ideas, and they may come from the opposite discipline. Because somebody thinks of something that we can do. Somebody thinks that, like, oh, here's an opportunity to do AR. Well, I don't work with AR very much in Sketch, right? Yeah. So that's great. Like my algorithm isn't encompassing that as frequently as somebody who has an itch to do some development work in that sphere.
Yeah, I view kickoff as an opportunity to get all the decision makers in one room and surface all the constraints on this project to actually figure out what we need to build, right? So some of the constraints may be the budget, and some of the constraints may be the team size or the ship date or the goals of the project. And we kind of take all those constraints together, and like Dave said, we want to end up rowing the boat in the same direction. Yeah. And I think it's super important to have both surfacing these high-level ideas, but also having developers in the room to make sure that the process stays grounded and actionable. So one experience I can remember is, Ben, you came up to me with an opportunity we had from a client, and you said, hey, this client wants to ship this app in 2 months. Can you make it happen?
I think I did a better job of making it exciting. But, but that was the gist of it.
Right. It was an exciting opportunity. And I said, yes, let's do it. But we need to leave this meeting, and I need to know exactly how the app is going to work, because this is a really tight timeline. And fast forward to the meeting, we have 4 of the most senior creatives in the company, and Jay, me, and the creatives are, waxing poetic about the brand and how this can be transformative or inspirational, and they're talking super, super high level. And my job in that meeting was to, rope them back down to earth and say, hey, 2 months. I need to get started on this today, and I need to know what it looks like and what it does.
I think that's, I vividly remember that meeting, because it really did take the project from, and I can completely see this, and I think this is why this is so important. If we had just had that creative team in that room by themselves, the project would have gone, one way, and we probably wouldn't have ever shipped. But by having everybody there together, it focused us, and I think you did a great job of providing that focus. But they also did a good job of pushing you, a little bit outside of what your maybe natural comfort zone was. So yeah, that's a fantastic example. Okay, so we've done the kickoff. Let's talk about. We usually come back for like an architectural or scaffolding meeting. What happens there?
Yeah, well, we call it a foundation meeting, and it's really the team kind of huddling up after the kickoff to make sure that we all agree about where we're rowing and what we're going to deliver on our sprint schedule and stuff. And I think it's essential even at that stage that you have the vetting of design by development. So one of our big deliverables in what we call Sprint Zero is an information architectural diagram, and Jay is particularly good and particularly particular about what that document looks like.
Can you elaborate on what an IA looks like?
Sorry, yeah, I say it IA, information architecture. So it's sort of how one might experience the app in each of the screens that you would likely encounter, and hopefully accounting for some of the edge cases that a designer might not be thinking about when they're thinking about happy path and great experience, right?
Like
so
drawers.
that drawers colliding, right?
Yeah.
So I can think of a particular project in which like Jay was not going to approve the information architectural diagram until it was buildable, which is exactly what's supposed to happen. And I was not getting there, right? Or it took a little while for me to get there, and Jay helped me get there. But that made, that is an investment, a tiny investment in time relative to having it wrong and proceeding.
Yeah, no, totally makes
And then
sense.
the other thing I'll say is that, another of our pieces in that Sprint Zero deliverable is wireframes, so that you could test those, right? Because all of the affordances are there. It's just it's not styled or anything, and you get.
We're going to get to usability testing.
Yeah, we'll get to that. But the other thing I was going to say is that at that point I'm out of a sense of responsibility to sort of express what I think is going to be the experience. I'll often put those into an After Effects file and really show the interaction patterns that I want to use, like not the prefigured or pre-configured ones that you might use in InVision or other prototyping tools, but the things that I think are unique to the app, part of what is the implicit design of that app and how that's supposed to work, so that Jay can vet those as well.
And this is my first opportunity to really push some questions back to the client. So if I look at your IA and I see some assumptions or some inconsistencies, like how did we get from this screen to this screen? What happens if there's no internet here? We can really surface some product questions that maybe we can come up with the answer to, or maybe we need to escalate up to the product team. So it's a really good investment of time at that point in the project lifecycle.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so then now we get into sort of our sprints, and for those who may be unfamiliar with Agile, think of it as 2-week increments where our team is going through some sort of the same thing essentially every 2 weeks and building something new each sprint. So what you'll see are things that happen every 2 weeks, in an ongoing manner. So let's just talk about like direct collaboration. What would we guide folks listening to do in terms of setting up great collaboration to find that implicit design?
Well, I think that the most fundamental thing I would recommend is, and this is something that we do, is to include design in your Agile software development process, because in all of the parts of Scrum or whatever Esculent you use. I'm using Esculent incorrectly, but anyway, whatever variety of it you're using, right? You want your designers to understand what it takes to build something, so they don't ask you to build things that are bad or wrong or going to slow us down. And you want your developers to understand what it takes for a designer to develop, to get you somewhere and give you something the right way.
And a really easy way to do that is to sit your product teams together.
Yeah.
So when
Like physically
sit them next to each other, because I want to see what Dave's process is, and I want to understand how to build towards his workflow, so I can communicate with him better, and I can help collaborate. And I can talk to him whenever I have questions.
One thing that I hear or am confronted with clients that want to work with us, oftentimes they're bringing us an app that was, designed in a way or built in a way that, design was very much on Mars, and I don't know if I'm getting the right, development was on Venus. One of the things that is clear is that when they handed the screens over, the engineers just took those screens and did exactly what was supposed to be on each screen. How do we force, because a lot of times it doesn't really work that way. There are transitions, there are things that happen sort of between the screens.
Yeah, right, and that's when your screens collide. That's when your drawers collide, right? So that I mentioned a little bit, but I spent a lot of time in After Effects actually, because my immediate boss, John Green, has this philosophy of designing between the screens and really thinking about how you get from one screen to the other. And there are really interesting things that you learn when you force yourself as a designer to think about where something is going to go and how it's going to come back, right? And you can find an awful lot of economy in the assets on screen, and you can reduce the sense of the duration of a process by making those things move on screen in a really efficient way. And so it's not like, I had to do 30 screens of onboarding. It's like, I think I pressed a lot of buttons, but I was on the same screen the whole time, or something like that, right? So you want to kind of reduce the friction that you encounter there.
Great. Okay, so another thing that happens in the Agile process is we go through refinement, where we essentially take the pieces of work that we think we're going to work on and we talk about and have a conversation. So what do you guys find that happens during that moment?
I find it super valuable to have each discipline in the room while the other discipline is refining their stories and estimating the effort and asking questions of product, because it really helps surface how the team solves problems, or how that discipline in particular solves problems. It can help surface things like, for instance, Dave may have an interaction that he thinks is super valuable to the user, but he may be guessing that it's very expensive from a development perspective, and sometimes it is, but sometimes there are solutions that he doesn't know about. Maybe they're, like, for instance, sometimes we lean on the material components library by Google, and maybe that grants some user experience that we weren't thinking about. But
so essentially finding shortcuts if we can, or just understanding that something is large and we might want to
and I think in general, like, if you're really trying to find the intrinsic qualities of the product demands, it's not going to be in sort of components, right? It's going to be in something else, I'll have those kinds of components. And somebody, great thoughtful companies have gone to the trouble of creating some of these things, and I think it's worth respecting the platform, because you want to give somebody an experience that they're accustomed to, and then the cool thing. So you want people to feel comfortable, whether it's an Android or an iOS, if they're whatever platform they're most accustomed to. You want it to feel native, and then.
So let's talk a little bit about that, because I know, Jay, during dev and design reviews, there are questions that you always ask. What are some of those questions that you think it's a good opportunity for you to ask?
Yeah, so I think refinement and dev and design review is by far like the least expensive opportunity to confront problems. When we churn on problems, or we learn about them way into implementation, that's when things start getting expensive. But in general, designers tend to design for the happy path, and you see a lot of comps with screens that have a bunch of content on them. And things that I like to challenge Dave on is, what does this screen look like on a really small screen, like an iPhone SE, or what does it look like on a huge screen, like
what are we going to do when the keyboard deploys?
What about like long languages like German? Is this all going to fit on the button? What happens? And then there are just the unhappy paths, or maybe just the not happy yet paths, like empty states, which is your user's first introduction to the application. We often think about what it looks like, after they've healthily been using it for months. But what does that very first interaction look like when there's no data in the application?
Right. Yeah, that's the Malcolm Gladwell moment, and it, maybe an empty state.
Yeah. Let's talk about usability testing, and then we'll wrap up with one quick example in the last couple of minutes.
I was saying earlier, I think it's never too early and it's never too late. To learn something about what you ought to be doing, and you'll always be surprised. And sometimes, you'll find some edification, but I find it an excruciating part of the process, but an absolutely necessary part of the process.
Yeah, and something we really subscribe to. always test, and I think we often say that the usability test is the ultimate arbiter of this dev and design tension.
Yeah.
It really can tell you, hey, well, this time we were right to go this way or that way. So
Yeah.
I think it's a really great tool in your tool chest. Okay, and then product ships. It's amazing.
Yay!
We're all excited. Let's jump to just a quick example to illustrate this.
Yeah.
Some of the work we did at Six Flags.
Yeah, Six Flags is interesting, and there are a whole bunch of interesting things that we got to do because it is it's an entertainment brand, and it's got a lot of fun associated with it and stuff. And we thought that this one might be an interesting one to share. So the screen on the left, you can kind of see that this is really kind of wireframe stage. There's the idea that we were going to have a park sort of representation in screens, but then because of the name. And because I think we had originally 6 navigation destinations, we're like, oh, this is perfect. This is going to line up. We're going to make these flags for each destination in the navigation. And as I was noodling around with it, I was like, oh, let's make them pennants, like they exist in the logo, and they're going to kind of undulate, as they move to the top and become the nav bar. And so I don't know if that's going to play. Is that going to play?
Yeah.
So you saw the kind of wave. And what was cool about this is that it kind of anticipated the whole Android material design ripple effect kind of thing, and I think by a little bit, not by a lot. But of course, it's not pretty, right? The pennant thing is odd, and then the undulation maybe is a little too dramatic. So we scaled that back, and it persisted.
I think we also got a lot of pushback from the engineering team that was going to be.
Oh, and I'm sorry,
really
I didn't even go into that. So one of the things that I had on my screen as I was playing with it, and Jay said, well, if you can give me the Bezier handle positions that you have in your After Effects file, I can try and approximate what that was, or what is going to happen there, and actually executed it, right? So yes, so it's only in user testing then, of course, that we've realized that this is is a good idea, but it fails, right? So and it's okay, right? Like fail early, fail often. So but the idea that there is some additional motion to that kind of interaction is something that we kept. It's just that it's not the wild idea that Dave was fascinated with.
A little more subtle.
Yeah, so it's a little bit more subtle. And then
delightful.
yeah, and then so then there's this notion of this animated park, and at that time we tried all sorts of different things that we could, means by which we could deliver this experience that's like the experience of going to the park, or make you feel like, oh, I want to ride that roller coaster or something like that. And so we had the idea that we would have an animated park in there, but the file formats and device dimensions and all of those things were really tough to make align. And so we found that we could scale back the file size by making kind of a monochromatic thing, and maybe that's better if we're going to have all these colorful flags. And so we maybe it's all rationalization, but we kind of came to a solution that seemed to make people pretty happy.
Very cool. All right, so let's give folks a couple of takeaways. Jay, you want to just talk us through these really quickly, and then we'll open it for questions. If folks have questions, feel free to add them to the questions module in the webinar. But we'll hit a couple of takeaways, and then we'll have time for a few questions.
Yeah, I think a couple of points that we want y'all to come away with from this webinar are, one, that great products are the union of design and technology. You can't really have one without the other. Designers and developers think differently. We approach problems differently, and that is not a bug, it's a feature. You want to use this to your advantage to build the best product you can. And the way to do that is to encourage frequent collaborative touch points between the two disciplines.
Yeah, like forcing your designers and developers to do webinars together.
Yeah. All right, awesome. Let's take some questions. So I guess this is for both Jay and Dave, but let's start with Jay. What are some ways that you like to challenge designers on projects?
Yeah. Good question. One thing I really like to do is to challenge designers to define the semantic meaning behind what they're asking of me. So I really try to limit them to 10 fonts in their palettes and a couple grays in their palettes. And if they want to introduce a new font or a new gray, that's great, but I want you to tell me what its job is and why you're using it. Because if I don't understand that, then I can't, if version 2 has a dark mode, I can't flip the script and figure out, what all these grays map to. So I'm kind of notoriously
That's a great example.
Yeah.
So no, you're particular about that, but I think that's
notoriously a little particular.
yeah, but at the same time, it's exactly what we're saying. It makes the design better, right? So why do you need like this extra font?
Yeah.
What does it add?
Yeah.
And if you can justify it, then it's in, right? If you can't justify it, then you're just being a capricious designer.
Yeah. So we have a couple of questions, but we're not going to be able to get to all of them. We only have really just time for one more. So it was actually the inverse of that question. So Dave, what are some ways that you'd like to challenge developers and projects?
I feel like the motion thing is the thing that I feel like is more of a specialty of mine, right? So if I like to explore different kinds of mechanics for how somebody is going to interact and engage with a particular app, and I feel like that's where I'm going to add more value than another designer maybe. And so it's that kind of stuff. Like, hey Jay, what if we have the person's picture up here, and then if they tap on the left, then they can see all the other pictures, and then we come back, and so I'll make a little I don't know, it's almost like one of those Pixar animatics, right? Of like, hey, could it go like this? Are there problems with this, Jay?
That's when people's heads explode.
Yeah, or you could do that. Sure, yeah, you can do something like that. But anyways, I feel like the motion makes it, or motion in design makes it more engaging. The other thing I would say too is that like I like to say, is there something that I'm missing here, right? So haptics, right? Like every time you Ben or Jay says, oh, you can have haptic response for this, and I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. I didn't think of it, and they should add haptics to Sketch.
They should. Cool. Well, we will leave it at that. There are a couple other questions we didn't get to, but we will certainly follow up with those of you who asked your questions offline. And just as a little plug for our next webinar, it's Tuesday, October 22nd. It's a great topic, cultivating a culture that embraces change. And then we have 2 more webinars in November. So thank you so much for joining us, and hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.